She was already dead. That was what Judd Hollis thought when he saw her lying under the pine tree, her body curled tight like something that had given up trying to stay warm. Her lashes were thick with ice. Her lips had gone the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard swallows the last light. Her dress, silk, ivory, tore across the bodice, had frozen stiff against her skin, and the sight of it stopped Judd's chest the way a sudden drop in temperature stops water cold inside a pipe. He stood there for exactly 1 second. 1 second of looking. 1 second of understanding. 1 second of deciding. Then he dropped to his knees in the snow and pressed 2 fingers against the side of her throat, where the skin beneath her jaw had gone white in wax and as candle tallow. He held his breath. The Wyoming wind screamed through the pines above him, bending the branches into frantic shapes, scattering loose snow across her still face. He waited, fingers pressing, listening with every nerve in his body. There, faint as the scratch of a mouse behind a wall. A pulse. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't look around for whoever might have left her here. He didn't stand up slowly and weigh his options like a man calculating the cost of a bale of feet. He slid his arms under her, one under her knees, one behind her back, and he lifted her off the frozen ground and held her against his chest and started walking. She weighed almost nothing. That scared him more than the cold. The cabin was a quarter-mile behind him through timber that didn't care how urgent a man was. The snow came to his thighs in some places. He broke through drifts that grabbed at his legs like they wanted to stop him, like the land itself had decided this woman was supposed to stay here in the cold and be done with it. Judd leaned into the wind and pushed. He bent his head down over hers, shielding her face from the storm. His lungs burned. His arms ached. He kept walking. He could see his breath crystallizing in the air in front of him, short, tight puffs, and her breath when he bent close was so faint he wasn't sure he was seeing it at all, or just imagining what he hoped was there. He talked to her while he walked, because he had heard once that a voice could reach a person even when nothing else could, even when their body had pulled itself down to the last small ember of living. "You're going to be all right," he said, and his voice came out rough from the cold and from the weight of meaning it. "You hear me? You're going to be fine. I've got you." The pines thinned. The cabin appeared through the white, smoke still curling from the chimney from the fire he'd banked that morning, a thin gray thread rising into the iron sky. He crossed the porch in 3 strides and hit the door with his shoulder and pushed inside. The heat hit him like a wall. He laid her down as gently as he could on the braided rug in front of the stove, and for a moment he just crouched over her and looked, cataloging what he was dealing with. Her skin was the color of birch bark. Her fingers were curled and stiff. The frozen silk of her dress was beginning to thaw at the edges, and the smell of cold water and pine resin came off her in waves. John Hollis had been ranching in Wyoming for 11 years. He had pulled calves in blizzards. He had reset his own broken finger against a fence post with no one to help him. He had nursed his horse Biscuit through a rattlesnake bite one brutal August when the nearest town was 40 miles away. He was not a man who panicked. But looking at this woman, with her blue lips and her ice-crusted lashes and her pulse thin as a thread, he felt something close to panic moving in him, and he breathed it back down and went to work. First, the fire. He threw 3 logs into the stove and a handful of dry kindling and pushed the draft all the way open until the flames roared up tall and hot. Then blankets. He stripped his bed and his linen chest and the old wool blanket he kept folded on the rocking chair and brought them all. He wrapped her in them while she lay still, tucking them around her shoulders and her feet, leaving her face uncovered so he could watch her breathing. It wasn't enough. He knew it. He had seen frostbite, had seen what cold could do to a person who had been out in it too long, and he knew that blankets and a fire could only do so much. The cold had gotten inside her. The only thing that worked fast enough now was body heat. Direct. Clothes. skin to skin. He knelt beside her and made himself say the thing plainly, not because she could hear him, but because he needed to hear himself say it clearly before he acted. "I'm going to warm you up," he said. "It's the only way. I won't do anything you wouldn't want. I'm going to keep you alive." He worked carefully, with his eyes averted where they needed to be averted, easing the frozen fabric away from her skin and replacing it with dry wool. He wrapped her again in the blankets, layered thick, and then he stripped off his coat and his shirt and lay down beside her, pulling her gently against his side, wrapping his arm around her so that his warmth could pass into her. She felt like holding a stone that had been sitting in a stream all winter. Judd kept breathing, slow and even, willing his heat into her. He took her hands between both of his and worked them carefully, not rubbing. He knew better than to rub frozen extremities, just holding them, warming them with steady pressure. The fire cracked and popped. Outside, the storm howled and slammed against the cabin walls like it was furious to have lost her. He talked to keep himself from thinking too hard about whether she was going to make it. He told her about the land, about the way the valley looked in June, when the snow melted off the peaks and ran down in 100 little streams and the grass came up so green it almost hurt to look at it. About the elk that came to drink at the creek behind his property every morning at first light. About his horses, Thunder, the big gray who was smarter than most men Judd had known, and Clover, the bay mare who would follow him around the yard like a dog if he let her. He told her about what had brought him here. Not a woman, not a fortune, not ambition. Just a need for quiet. A need for land that didn't ask anything from him except honesty and work. He had come out to Wyoming with $200 in a pack horse and had broken himself against this ground for years before it gave him anything back. Now it was his, as much as land could belong to anyone. 160 acres of grass and rock and sky, and it was enough. It had always been enough. Her breathing was still faint when the first light of morning crept under the cabin door, but it was there. He let himself feel something like hope. She hovered for 3 days. Judd did not leave the cabin. He barely left her side. He kept the fire running hot and the room warm enough that he sweated through 2 shirts. He made broth from the venison he had curing in the cold box and fed it to her a spoonful at a time when she was just barely conscious enough to swallow, which was not often. He changed the warm stones he kept wrapped in flannel and tucked against her feet and her sides when they cooled. He sat up through the nights listening to her breathe, counting the seconds between each breath, ready to do something, though he wasn't entirely sure what, if the breathing stopped. On the second night she moved. Her hand twitched against the blanket, and she made a sound that wasn't quite a word, and Judd leaned close. "You're safe," he said. "I've got you. Don't try to move yet." She stilled. On the 4th morning she woke. He was sitting across the room with a cup of coffee when it happened. He heard the change in her breathing. It sharpened, deepened, and then she gasped like she'd been held underwater and had just broken the surface, and she sat up fast, eyes wide, looking around the cabin with the frantic scanning of a creature that has learned to expect danger everywhere it finds itself. Her eyes landed on Judd. She had violet eyes. He hadn't expected that. "Where am I?" Her voice was barely a sound. A scrape of sound. "Who are you?" He set his coffee down slowly and moved to the chair beside the bed, keeping his movements deliberate and easy, the way he moved around the horse that didn't know him yet. "Name's Judd Hollis. This is my place, my cabin, on my land. Found you out by the north fence 4 days ago, near frozen to death." He paused. "You're safe here." She swallowed. He could see her deciding how much to believe that. "Anna Bishop," she said finally. "I work as a governess. For a family near Laramie." She told him she had run. That someone had frightened her. that she had ridden through the storm and lost her horse and found herself on foot in the dark with the snow coming down and the temperature dropping, and she had known she was in trouble, but there had been nowhere to go. It was a story full of the right words arranged in the wrong order. Judd listened without interrupting. He nodded at the right moments. He refilled her water and handed her a piece of bread and watched her while she ate it. And what he watched was not the words, but everything around the words. The way she held herself, straight and careful even in weakness. The kind of posture that didn't come from years of bending over children and lesson books. The way her hands moved, smooth-palmed and ringless except for a faint indentation on one finger where a ring had recently been moved. The way her eyes, even exhausted as they were, moved around the room with sharp, assessing attention, reading the space, reading him. She was not a governess. He didn't say so. Over the days that followed, she began to heal, and as she healed she began to move around the cabin, and as she moved around the cabin a different person emerged from behind the story of Anna Bishop, governess of Laramie. She could cook, but she cooked like someone who had learned it late, with too much precision and too much wonder at the results. She swept the floor with perfect thoroughness and then stood looking at the broom like she wasn't entirely sure what to do with it next. She was curious about everything in the cabin, the books on a shelf, the maps on the wall, the tools hanging by the door, with the curiosity of someone who was accustomed to having access to things and found their absence interesting rather than distressing. One morning she went to the paddock within to feed the horses, and Clover, who trusted no one she didn't know and would pin her ears flat at a stranger on sight, walked right to her and dropped her great hand into the woman's outstretched hands as if she had been waiting for her. The woman's face did something complicated. "You've been around horses," Judd said. "I learned by watching," she said, too quickly, and turned away. That evening he found the ring. It had slipped from somewhere in the blankets when he was changing the linens, heavy gold, signet style, with a crest pressed into the face of it. He knew that crest. He had seen it on documents in Cheyenne, on stationery and legal papers, and the kind of business correspondence that moved through the territory with the weight of money behind it. The Ashford family. Silver mines in Montana and Colorado. Land from the Panhandle to the Powder River. One of the largest private fortunes in the American West. He put the ring back where he had found it. He said nothing. But something shifted in him, not suspicion exactly, more like a sharpening of attention, the way a man's eyes narrow when the sky changes and he knows weather is coming. 3 evenings after that, she asked him about himself. They were sitting by the fire, the way they had fallen into the habit of doing. Her with a book from his shelf and him with the leather harness he was mending, the two of them quiet in the way people who are comfortable with each other are quiet. The storm had eased but not broken, and the wind still moved around the cabin in long, slow circles, looking for a way in. "What were you before this place?" she asked. Judd pulled a stitch through the leather. "Ranching is what I've always been. Before Wyoming, then." He looked at the fire for a moment. "Worked for my uncle. Down in Colorado. Cattle operation. Good land. Did something happen?" "My cousin wanted what wasn't his," Judd said. "James Thornfield. He found ways to make things difficult until I left." He didn't look at her when he said it, but he felt the silence change. He glanced over. She had gone the color of new ash. "I'm tired," she said, and stood up and walked from the room before he could speak. He heard her crying that night, soft sounds through the thin wall between the rooms, and he lay awake and listened and felt it pull at something in him that he wasn't prepared for. The next day brought the rain and the incident with the horse. A thunderstorm rolled in off the mountains without much warning, and while Judd was checking the paddock fence, one of his mares, Belle, a big chestnut who had come to him half broken and nervous as a cat, spooked at a crack of lightning and reared up hard, front hoofs slashing the air 3 feet from where the woman was standing. She didn't step back. She stepped forward. She came in close and fast, inside the arc of those hoofs, and she lifted one hand flat toward the horse's face and spoke, not in English, but in French, low and sharp and absolutely certain, and Belle froze as if she had been nailed to the ground. Judd stood in the rain with water running off the brim of his hat and stared. The woman stroked Belle's neck with long, sure strokes, still talking in that low voice, and the horse stood trembling but still, and after a minute the trembling stopped too. When she turned around, she found Judd looking at her. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "The family I worked for. They had French tutors. Governess families don't usually have horses like Belle." Her lips pressed together. "Who are you?" he asked. Quietly. No edge in it. Just a plain question. Something moved across her face. He thought she was going to tell him. The truth was right there, pressing against the inside of her expression, and for a moment she looked almost relieved by the prospect of letting it out. Then she turned and walked back toward the cabin, and he followed, and neither of them said anything else. But that night, when he came in from stabling the horses, he saw the paper. She had bent to pick up a blanket that had slipped from the chair, and as she bent forward her bodice opened slightly at the front, and he saw it, folded tight, tucked close to her skin, its seal blurred from the rain but its large printed words perfectly legible. Charlotte Ashford, missing, reward offered. Judd stood very still. Charlotte Ashford. Not Anna Bishop. Charlotte Ashford, only heir to the Ashford fortune, daughter of the late Thomas Ashford, one of the most powerful private citizens Wyoming Territory had ever produced, reported missing 11 days ago from her home outside Cheyenne. Reward, substantial. Return, requested by her fiancé, Mr. James Thornfield, of Denver, Colorado. James Thornfield. His cousin. Judd went outside and stood in the cold for a long time. When he came back in, he sat down across from her and waited. "Charlotte," he said. She looked up from the book she was pretending to read. "That your name?" Her throat moved. Her eyes went very still. "Yes," she said. The fire cracked. The wind moved around the cabin. "What are you running from?" Charlotte Ashford closed the book and set it in her lap and looked at him with violent eyes that had stopped hiding. "A marriage," she said. "To a man who wants to own me." "James Thornfield," Judd said. "Your cousin," she said. "Yes." The room held itself quiet while the understanding of that finished settling. "Tell me," Judd said. She told him. Her father had been a good man, she said, complicated and often absent, absorbed in the business of his empire, but a man who had loved her in his way and had wanted her protected and secure. He had arranged the engagement to Thornfield 2 years before his death. Thornfield came recommended by business associates, by lawyers, by the kind of men who moved money around and called it civilization. He was handsome and polished and unfailingly courteous, and in the beginning Charlotte had thought it might be all right. But she had begun to notice things. Small things at first. The way he talked about her father's holdings, not with admiration, but with the particular focus of a man inventorying something he expects to inherit. The way he dismissed her opinions with a patience so studied it was almost a kind of violence. The way he watched her, not with desire but with assessment, as if calculating what she was worth and whether the figure matched his expectations. Then she had heard about Eliza. James Thornfield's first wife had died 3 years ago. Everyone in the territory knew the story, a riding accident, tragic. The man was devastated. He had never fully recovered. Everyone knew it and everyone had accepted it, and no one had questioned it because James Thornfield was rich and respected, and because the word of a rich, respected man weighs more than most things in most places. But Charlotte had met a woman in Cheyenne, a widow who had known Eliza Thornfield, who had been her friend, and this woman had told Charlotte things over tea one afternoon that had changed the shape of everything Charlotte thought she understood. Eliza had found something. ledgers, financial records going back years, showing money that had moved from accounts it shouldn't have moved from, accounts belonging to families who had trusted James Thornfield to manage their affairs, families who were smaller and less powerful and less able to ask hard questions. Money that had been taken quietly and carefully and covered with the kind of paperwork that looked legitimate until you knew what you were looking at. And Eliza had known what she was looking at, because Eliza had been smart. She had confronted James. 1 week later, she was dead. The horse had thrown her on a trail she had ridden 100 times. The horse was found unhurt. Eliza's body was found at the base of a rocky drop that she had ridden past without incident every week for 3 years. Charlotte had listened to this woman in Cheyenne and had felt the floor of her understanding shift under her feet like ice over deep water. She had gone home and looked at James Thornfield across the dinner table that evening with new eyes. And she had seen, because she was looking for it now, because she knew what to look for. She had seen the way his eyes moved over her, calculating, patient, proprietary. He didn't love her. He was never going to love her. She was the key to the Ashford holdings, and once he had married her and established legal control over the estate, she would be as useful to him as Eliza had been, and she would become as much of a problem as Eliza had become, and she would meet whatever end a woman met when she became a problem to a man like James Thornfield. She had begun to plan. It had taken 3 months. She had moved money, small amounts, to accounts he didn't know about. She had written letters to lawyers in 2 states, describing what she knew, leaving them unsealed and unaddressed in a place where they would be found and sent if she disappeared. She had mapped the roads out of Cheyenne and identified the least watched of them. She had packed a bag that she kept hidden behind a loose board in the back of her wardrobe. And then one night she had heard 2 of James's men talking in the stable yard below her window, and what they were saying had told her that she was out of time, that whatever he was planning was planned for the following week, and she had gone to her room and taken her bag and walked out of the house in the dark. She had ridden through the storm. She had lost her horse at the creek crossing when the water came up fast and the animal panicked and threw her. She had walked until she couldn't walk anymore. And then Judd Hollis had found her in the snow. The cabin was very quiet when she finished. The fire had burned down to a low red glow while she talked, and Judd had not moved, had barely breathed, for most of it. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped and his eyes on her face. "He's going to come here," he said. "I know. He sent men already. Crawford. I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "I heard the horses that night, Judd. I heard you send them away." He had protected her even then, even before he knew who she was, even when it would have been easier and more profitable to have handed her over and collected whatever James Thornfield was offering. Charlotte had thought about that a great deal in the days since. She had spent years among people who made calculations, who weighed every relationship against its value, who measured loyalty in dollars. She had forgotten what it looked like when a person simply did the right thing because it was the right thing. She had been remembering it ever since she woke up in Judd Hollis's cabin and found him sitting across the room with his coffee, watching her breathe. "We can't stay here," Judd said. "I know. Cheyenne. Federal court. You can tell what you know publicly. Give them the letters you sent to those lawyers. Make it impossible for him to cover." Charlotte shook her head. "He owns men in Cheyenne. Sheriffs, judges. He's been buying influence for 20 years. He doesn't own all of them," Judd said. "He can't. There are too many." She wanted to believe him. She looked at his face, at the steady certainty in it, and she wanted to hold on to it with both hands. Then the hoofbeats came. They heard them before they reached the yard, multiple horses, moving fast, spreading out. Judd was on his feet before the sound fully registered, his hand on the rifle he kept near the door. Charlotte was right behind him. He held up one hand to keep her back and eased the door open. 3 men in the yard. Hard-faced, well-armed, sitting their horses with the relaxed confidence of men who had done this before and expected it to end the same way it always ended. "Mr. Hollis," the lead man said. "We're here for the woman." "Private land," Judd said. "You're trespassing." Mr. Thornfield doesn't recognize property claims that stand between him and what's his. Charlotte stepped through the doorway and stood beside Judd before he could stop her. The lead man saw her and smiled. "Miss Ashford, Mr. Thornfield is very relieved you're alive." "Tell James," Charlotte said, "that I belong to no one." The smile faded. Judd kept his rifle low but ready, his hand loose on the stock, his eyes moving across all 3 men, reading distances and angles. The lead man looked at him with the particular contempt of someone who has the numbers and knows it. "One cowboy," the man said, almost to himself. "Against the Thornfield name and a $50,000 reward." "That reward doesn't interest me," Judd said. The man studied him. Whatever he found in Judd's face seemed to suggest that argument would be expensive. He lifted his hand and signaled his men to fall back. "We'll be back," he said, "with more friends." They rode out. Judd and Charlotte stood in the yard and listened to the hoofbeats fade into the trees. Then Judd said, "Pack what you can carry." They left before dawn, traveling the back trail through the timber, avoiding the open valley. Judd took Thunder and saddled his second horse for Charlotte. The air was thin and cold and smelled of pine and coming snow, and the mountains around them were gray shapes in the dark, enormous and indifferent. For a long time they rode without speaking. Then Charlotte said, "Judd." He looked over. "Whatever happens," she said, "I want you to know you saved my life. Not just from the cold." He didn't answer right away. The horses moved beneath them, steady and quiet. "You would have saved yourself," he said finally. "I just moved up the timeline." She laughed, and it was the first real laugh he had heard from her, startled out of her, unguarded, warm, and it hit him somewhere behind his ribs and stayed. They heard the riders in the pass. Judd heard them first, the particular sound of hooves on rock, moving in a pattern that wasn't accidental. He held up his fist and Charlotte pulled her horse to a stop and they sat listening, and then Judd saw the glint of metal on the ridge above them and understood. Not a chase. A trap. Crawford's men had been driving them. The pass ahead was blocked. The ridge above was manned. They were being funneled into a corridor with no exit, and someone had known this land well enough to plan it. Judd turned Thunder hard to the left. "Stay with me," he said. Charlotte didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She leaned low over her horse's neck and followed him off the trail and into the shadow of the rock face, where a narrow cut in the stone, barely wide enough for a horse, climbed steeply toward the ridge. He had found this cut years ago. He had never mentioned it to anyone. The horses scrambled up the loose stone, hooves ringing against rock, and behind them the shouts of Crawford's men echoed off the cliff face as they realized they had lost sight of their quarry. Bullets cracked, but the angle was wrong. They were shooting blind, into the sound of hoofs. Judd reached the stone shelf below the ridgeline and dropped from Thunder's back and pulled Charlotte down beside him. She was breathing hard, her face pale but her eyes clear. "Can you shoot?" he asked. "No. You're about to learn." He pressed his revolver into her hands. "Point at where you want to stop. Squeeze slowly. Don't close your eyes." She looked down at the gun in her hands. Her jaw tightened. "All right," she said. Men were working their way down the ridge toward them. Judd could hear boots on rock, unhurried, certain. He waited, listening for the right moment, and then he rose and fired, and one of the men went down and the others scrambled for cover, and in that scramble he grabbed Charlotte's arm and said, "Up. Now." They climbed. Charlotte climbed like she had done it before, her hands sure on the rock, her feet finding purchase where you would not have expected it. She scraped her palms raw and didn't slow down. When he reached back to pull her up the worst sections, she came without needing to be told, reading the movement of his hand before he had time to speak. They came over the ridge gasping and threw themselves flat against the rocky ground on the far side, out of the angle of fire from below, and lay there for a moment breathing. Then Charlotte said, "There are more of them." He heard it. Hooves in the trees beyond the ridge, coming around from the east. Crawford had anticipated this too. Had men waiting on both sides. Judd looked at the timber that ran down the far slope into a narrow valley. "Run?" Charlotte said. "Run," he agreed. They were almost to the trees when the voice came. Quiet. Composed. Coming from between the pines like it had been waiting there all along. "Charlotte." She stopped walking as if she'd been struck. Judd turned. James Thornfield stepped out of the shadow of the pines. He was well dressed for the mountains, a concession to practicality that sat awkwardly on him, like a costume worn by someone whose real clothes were elsewhere. His face was exactly as Judd remembered it from years ago, handsome, intelligent, and as warm as the underside of a river stone. "Cousin," James said, looking at Judd with mild curiosity, as if they had run into each other at a social occasion. "I had wondered if you were involved in this." "James," Judd said, "you've been rather inconvenient." James looked at Charlotte. "Come home, Charlotte. This has been embarrassing for everyone." "I will not," Charlotte said. James's expression shifted by a fraction. Not much. Just enough to show what was underneath the courtesy. "You have no choice," he said. "You are my fiancée. Your father arranged this. The law is on my side." "Your first wife thought the law would protect her," Charlotte said. The trees went silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. James Thornfield's face went very still. "I would be careful," he said softly, "about making accusations you cannot substantiate." "I have letters," Charlotte said. "Sealed and placed with lawyers in 2 states, with instructions to open them if I cannot personally confirm my safety once a week. Those letters describe what I know about Eliza. About your financial arrangements with certain families in Colorado. About the account records that exist, in places you don't know about, that show exactly what kind of man you are." Something shifted behind James's eyes. A calculation happening. He was reassessing, adjusting. "Those letters would ruin you too," he said. "The scandal." "I don't care about the scandal," Charlotte said. "I will renounce every penny of my father's estate. I will give every mine, every acre of land, every dollar and every account to the territory of Wyoming before I come back to you. Take it all. I don't want it." The silence was complete. James Thornfield stared at her. It was clear that he had never once considered this possibility. He had planned for resistance. He had planned for leverage. He had planned for flight and capture and the kind of capitulation that came when a woman understood she had no practical options. He had not planned for a woman who would simply open her hands and let everything fall. "You would give up your fortune," he said. "To save my life," Charlotte said. Without hesitation. Something broke in James's face then. Not sorrow. Not even real anger. Something colder. The face of a man who has had a calculation go wrong and is already moving to the next one. He reached into his coat. Charlotte was already moving. She stepped directly in front of Judd, arms out, body between him and James, and she said, "Stop," and the word came out with a kind of absolute authority that made even James Thornfield pause. That pause was enough. Judd moved around her and into James, one hand slamming the pistol aside, the shot exploding harmlessly into the trees, and they went down together into the dirt and snow and rocks and fought the way men fight when there is nothing between them and the truth of what they are. James was stronger than he looked, or maybe just desperate in the way that men who have never been denied anything become desperate when they finally are. He fought wildly, with no skill but with real ferocity, and Judd took blows to the jaw and the shoulder before he got enough of a position to pin James down and hold him. He pressed him against the ground, one forearm across his chest, and looked into his cousin's face. "If you come after her again," Judd said, breathing hard, "I will make sure every court in the territory hears everything she knows. Every letter, every account, every name." James looked up at him with cold, flat hatred. Crawford's remaining man appeared at the edge of the trees, took one look at the situation, and turned his horse and rode away. After a moment, James Thornfield rose, brushed himself off with the careful motions of a man reassembling dignity he had lost, and walked into the trees and was gone. Judd stood up. Charlotte came to him immediately, her hands going to his face, his shoulder, checking for damage with the focused efficiency of someone who needed to be doing something. "You're hurt," she said. "I'm breathing," he said. "That's enough for now." She stopped checking him and just looked at him. "Judd," she said. Her voice had changed. The careful, controlled voice of Anna Bishop, governess of nowhere, was completely gone. This was just her voice. "I have to go to Cheyenne. I know. I have to say all of it in public. In front of a court. All the things I told you. I know that too. Will you come with me?" He looked at her. At the violet eyes that weren't hiding anymore, and hadn't been, really, since the night she stopped pretending to be someone else and told him the truth by the fire. He looked at her steady hands and her straight back and the expression on her face that was not a request for rescue but something entirely different. Something he wasn't entirely sure he had a word for. "Yes," he said. They rode to Cheyenne with the mountains behind them, two figures small against the enormous sky, the horses moving at an easy pace because they were both too tired for anything dramatic and the road was long and they had time. Charlotte Ashford stood before the federal court in Cheyenne 3 days later and said everything. She said it all, from the beginning, in a clear, composed voice that did not waver once. She presented the letters. She named names and dates and account numbers. She described what she knew about Eliza Thornfield's death and why she knew it and where the evidence could be found. She answered every question the court put to her with the same directness and the same steady calm, and when it was finished she looked at the men behind their bench and said, "I am renouncing any claim my engagement to James Thornfield gave him over my father's estate. Every legal document he holds that relies on my consent, I am withdrawing that consent. Whatever remains mine after that renunciation, I offer to the territorial government. I want none of it. I want only my life and my freedom." The court was very quiet. James Thornfield's attorneys, 3 of them, sat in a row and said nothing. The marshals who arrested James Thornfield found him at the hotel where he had been staying, in the dining room, eating lunch with the particular composure of a man who has decided that composure is the last thing he has left. He didn't fight them. He stood up from the table and adjusted his jacket and walked out between them with his chin up, as if he was simply walking to an appointment. Judd watched from across the street, leaning against the wall of the land office with his arms crossed. When it was over, when the courthouse had emptied and the marshals had ridden away and the crowd that had gathered had dispersed to the saloons and the telegraph office to report what they had seen, Charlotte came down the courthouse steps and stood in the January sunlight. She stood there for a moment, just breathing. Then she found Judd across the street and walked to him. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't running. She crossed the street at a walk, the way a person crosses a street when they are going somewhere they mean to go, with no urgency because they are exactly where they are supposed to be. She stopped in front of him. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. They stood in the sunlight. Down the street, a piano was playing something cheerful in a saloon. Horses moved past. Somewhere a child was laughing. Charlotte looked at him and he looked at her, and after a long moment she held out her hand, not the way a woman holds out her hand to be kissed or to be helped, but the way a person offers a hand to someone they intend to walk forward with. He took it. They walked away from the courthouse into the wide, clear afternoon, and the Wyoming sky stretched out above them, enormous and blue and indifferent and beautiful, and for the first time in longer than she could count, Charlotte Ashford walked forward without looking over her shoulder. She was not running. She was not hiding. She was not anyone's prize or property or problem. She was simply a woman walking into the next part of her life, with her hand in the hand of a man who had found her frozen in the snow and had never once, in all the time since, treated her as anything less than someone worth saving. The mountains stood to the west, pink in the late light. The road went on ahead of them, long and open and entirely their own.